Welcome to the Neurofaith Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Curt Thompson, and we are here to explore what it means to live at the intersection of emerging scientific discoveries about the mind and following and being formed by Jesus, and how that can lead us into a world of greater human flourishing. We are eager to hear from our guests not only about the work they are doing, but how it speaks to what it means for us to thrive in our present particular moment. My guests on today's episode are Jon and Tristen Collins. Tristen is a licensed professional counselor with a focus on trauma recovery, a wayfinder coach, and a soccer mom of 2 active boys. Her husband Jon is co-founder of the BibleProject and pioneered the medium of explainer videos with his early marketplace work. Together, with Tristen's training in mental health and Jon's curious mind, they wrote a book called Why Emotions Matter to explore embodied spirituality. Jon and Tristen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
So as we were talking about in the beginning of our time, we like to begin with inviting our guests to talk a little bit about what it is about their own personal story that drew them into the work that you're now doing, and would love to hear you each talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'll start. So I grew up here in the Pacific Northwest. That's where we're at now. And I consider myself a rational skeptic. I live inside my head, and I love to think about things, and I love to try to understand things. And I grew up in a Christian home that was very interested in understanding the Bible. So that became an early obsession of mine, is trying to understand this book and what it means for how to be human, the question often was, how do you get to heaven? But really trying to understand what this book was all about. So I went off to Bible college, and I studied at a college here in Portland, Oregon, and began to realize that my obsession with understanding things kind of expanded beyond just the Bible. And I felt really too young and just too ill-equipped to really understand and explain the Bible. So that got me interested in just honing the skills of explanation in other formats. And so I started doing work for a lot of tech companies, explaining their software and technology, and beginning to learn this medium of explainer videos, taking ideas and turning them into these short visual explanations.
Okay. So I'm like a 59-year-old dude.
Yeah.
So explainer videos. Could you please explain explainer videos?
Yeah. So when YouTube became popular back in the early 2000s, it created a new form of distribution, which allowed for people to share videos more readily. And also, everyone had access to better equipment and software that allowed you to make videos in your home. And so the synthesis of that became being able to make really simple, cartoony videos using text and drawings and illustrations to explain a concept and put it up online, and then people could share it, and it helped people kind of understand all sorts of things. And the tech world really began to love these, because the tech world had really difficult to explain ideas like cloud computing or whatever their new piece of software was supposed to do and why. And so these short animated videos just helped unlock that for people. So this craft of explaining things visually and concisely became this really wonderful medium to help people have a paradigm shift. But underneath that was just, for me, a desire to understand the world. And one of the things in our relationship, Tristen and I, that was hard for me to understand was the world of emotions. I grew up believing that emotions were like a liability, something not to be trusted, something to repress and ignore and to rise above. And so one of the conflicts that constantly came up in our marriage was our opinion on how to deal with emotions. And one day Tristen brought home for me a chart that she got during grad school of here's all the emotions. So just look at it and identify what you feel, and then we can talk about it. And I hung it up by my computer and I looked at it, but it felt like looking at the like dashboard of an airplane cockpit. Like
Yeah.
it just made no sense to me. But at the same time, Tristan's like going to school, really thinking about these things. And so we wanted a project that allowed us to work on this together.
Yeah, Jon and I both went to the same Bible college, and so we met through friends that way. But it was just through school that I realized that I was more interested in psychology, and that understanding how theology intersect with psychology was a big interest for me. So I ended up going to graduate school, and more specifically learning about psychology and counseling. And then during that time, just having more, realizations about the value of emotions. And so, of course, coming home and wanting to share with Jon the new things that I'm learning. And yeah, we just had some interesting conversations of just our different perspectives and how to deal with emotions. And so we've been married for almost 19 years now. And so this book has kind of just been our culmination of our journey of learning, for me professionally, but then also for us personally. It's very personal information for our relationship.
I would love to hear you each talk a little bit about the book. First of all, what are some things that you are really deeply pleased with that came out of that project together? And also, part of what, not just what pleased you, I wonder if there was anything that surprised you that emerged out of that project together. And just tell our audience what the book is about and its title and so forth. We're going to push that at the end, but I would love to hear about some of those things.
Yeah, so we did this in order to create a shared language for each other that we could use to understand emotions. And I actually really wanted to understand what emotions were. I didn't have a good way to think about what emotions were. And like I said, I just kind of lived in this world of thought. And so the big thing for me, the big significant piece was understanding the role of emotions. And I'd explain it this way in that we have this just rich inner world of our body doing all sorts of cool stuff for us. It's engaging with the world. It's processing all of this information, sensory information, how we feel what's going on outside. And it's doing this underneath our conscious awareness. And it's making all these predictions about what we need to thrive and survive. And it's beautiful that God designed it this way. And so for me, to begin to understand emotions as my body tapping into information made me really interested in getting access to that information too. As a rational person, like I want more information. I want to understand things more. And so understanding that my body had an intelligence and that feelings and emotions were my access to that intelligence. And so Tristen had this really great metaphor she developed of the dashboard, which was kind of key to helping me understand that.
Yeah, just that I thought it was helpful to kind of think about emotions like the signals on the dashboard of our car, where, they aren't right or wrong, but it's more about looking at that information and trying to assess what is it trying to communicate to me. And oftentimes what it's communicating is unmet needs. And so
Can you give us an example of that?
Yeah. So I think, let's say, for example, with the emotion of shame, that, that signal might be going off on our dashboard. And so I think when we look into it as, okay, this is trying to communicate something to me. What is it trying to communicate? And one of the suggestions we gave is that it could be communicating there's a threat to your identity. Because shame is often, this label that we put on ourselves or someone else puts on us that isn't our true God-given identity. And so shame makes us feel, unworthy and not valuable, made in the image of God, human. And so I think when we can look at our dashboard as signals on the car, it can help us to become more curious rather than, ooh, I don't like this feeling and I want to cover up my dashboard, because that actually can make it more difficult to navigate life if we don't know what our body is trying to communicate to us.
Mhm. Yeah. I'm wondering, in the course of your working together on this, again, back to this question of what surprised you about this, and how would you say that any of those surprises now have changed the way that you are being with one another or being out in the world of life and work that you're living in?
Yeah, for me, the biggest surprise, I talk about it in the book, was changing my perspective on what it means to be human from that I have a body, that I'm kind of the soul or mind trapped in a body, to what turns out to be a more biblical perspective, which is I am a body. And that detaching from my emotions is not the point. And this idea of being embodied creatures, that God created us as living, in Hebrew, it's nephesh. It's the word we translate as soul. And that comes preloaded in our psyche as this disembodied kind of platonic soul that floats away one day. But in the Hebrew imagination, nephesh, it more literally means throat. And that's a metaphor for the part of you that's kind of like most connected. It connects you to life. It's where, food comes down. It's where you breathe through. It's like the most embodied part of you, really, your
Hmm.
throat.
Hmm.
And it becomes this metaphor to describe actually just what it means to be an embodied being. We still use this phrase in the airline industry where you say, hey, we've got 100 souls aboard this plane. They don't mean 100 disembodied, you know, spirits. They actually mean the old English way of that word, which is like a person. And that the purpose that God gave us is to be bodies, and that the hope in the Bible is resurrection,
Hmm. Indeed.
to be reformed into new bodies. So that man was such a surprise to me. That was not the paradigm I had about what it means to be human. And so there's a great book by Anthony Damasio who called Descartes' Error, which kind of really gets to this idea that Rene Descartes famously told us, "I think, therefore I am." In other words, the most important part of me is my rational thought, and everything else can be discarded. And that became kind of a main frame for the way we think about things, and even the way that psychology thought about things for a while. And now we understand that that's kind of a false dualism, and it's not even really found in the Bible. That I'm not merely my thoughts; I am my entire body. And so, understanding my emotions is deeply connected to what it means to be the image of God.
Right. And at the same time, I'm aware that in looking at your book, you have sections that explore particular emotions. And that presumes that there is a part of me, maybe it's my throat part that represents, well, who knows, but there is a part of me that at any given time has the capacity to actually pause and observe part of me that is feeling ashamed or angry or afraid or whatever that is. And I'm wondering also, Tristen, I would love for you to talk, first of all, again, also what surprised you, what's been helpful about this project together, and love for you to speak a little bit more about even your experience as a clinician, how it makes a difference for your clients, for your patients, in terms of really inviting them into this space where they recognize emotion to be what you're discovering it to be.
Definitely. Well, one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book is for some of my clients, because part of my training has been in understanding the impact of our past trauma, especially with abuse. And so I think when you grow up in a family where your feelings aren't valued, it's easy to start to take that paradigm into adulthood. And what I noticed is that clients that have experienced trauma, oftentimes it comes up in their feelings, even in present day, even though it's from the past. And so I can empathize in that it's frustrating when you have these emotions that, fear, for example, that in your present circumstances, like, oh, my husband's a safe person. I shouldn't be afraid that he's touching me. And so what's so difficult is that it doesn't make sense to you in the present circumstance. So part of you could easily explain it away, like, oh, see, emotions are bad. Instead of that, your body is communicating to you that the past circumstance that you experienced hasn't been resolved. So it hasn't really been integrated, and you would understand this, in your mind and body. And so because of that lack of integration, your body is confusing the present day circumstance as the danger from the past. And that can feel just like crazy making to people. And so post-traumatic stress disorder is, one of those confused, I'd call it like confused signals that create chaos for people. And so, you're much more likely to struggle with addiction and a lot of self-sabotage because it's so difficult to deal with these emotions that don't make sense, but they are there for a reason. And there are great tools out there, specifically like EMDR is one of those great trauma tools that help people to process these confusing signals.
So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit then to, we have, you mentioned, Jon, that this, we kind of live in the wake of Descartes and the kind of this dualism that we've made up in our heads that doesn't really exist if you look at the way our brains and bodies and minds and emotion all work. I'm wondering, especially as our listeners are mostly thoughtful people of faith, what does it mean for us? What are the significant things that we can learn? And I'm also curious for you too, Tristen, like how what you just said is applicable not just to the client that comes into your office with PTSD, but we have a lot of structures in our churches. We have a lot of business. We have a lot of things that organize themselves around this notion that emotion is this thing we have to put up with, but that it is not something necessarily that informs us very much. We have faith structures in which we've been taught and preached and so forth and so on that sees faith as this abstract, rational algorithm rather than an embodied, breathing, living, being, emotional force in the world. And I'm wondering, I'd love to hear again how each of you would see how what you're doing in the book and your collaborative work together, what that has to say to our faith communities about what does it mean for us to be people of faith, and how paying attention to the things that you're paying attention to makes it more likely for us to flourish.
There's a lot of different perspectives about emotions amongst many different faith communities. The one I grew up in, the one I think a lot of people are familiar with, is one that you just described. That it's my relationship with God is a rational puzzle to be solved, and going to heaven is about knowing the right kind of the right things and being able to say the right things and believe the right things. And this theological puzzle, it became this rational game. And then also a part of that is a distrust in emotions because they're all connected to the vices. And so it all came down to a lot of suspicion that emotions can't be trusted, and a desire to just kind of control and rein in our emotions. Actually, Plato famously gave the analogy of the charioteer being pulled by two horses. The charioteer represents your rational mind, and the two horses represent your emotions. The one was like the noble emotions, and one was like the ugly emotions. But both of them were pulling you along, and you, with your rational mind, need to rein them in and control them. And that's the dualism that I think was wholly adopted by many faith traditions. We need to just rein in and control our emotions. And what we understand now is more like emotion and reason are co-pilots that are working together.
Mm-hmm.
And we can think about our emotions, and our emotions actually shape our thoughts, and it works together. And that the Spirit of God can actually come in and help transform both. And so we actually need help to rein in everything, our flesh in general, as the Apostle Paul says. So by being curious and respectful of emotions, wanting to kind of come to them on their own terms and understand them was a different perspective than I was given. Um, and it's not to say that they're always going to be good or right, but that they are signaling something important and they have something valuable to teach us.
I think in the faith communities, what I've noticed is there's confusion between emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. And they kind of get just, and I'm sure you've probably seen this too, where they just get all just in the same boat,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I'm feeling angry, and therefore it's okay for me to yell
Mm-hmm.
at somebody. Um, and so, we intuitively feel like, okay, that's wrong. And so we might say, well, it's bad to be angry instead of, anger isn't the problem. It's what you're doing with the anger,
Mm-hmm.
and that the behavior of yelling isn't okay. Another thing that I think people pick up on is lies that we might believe. And I would say that's a thought that we have that takes, time to identify. And so emotions give us information of, what lies we might be believing. And so let's say, the lie is, I believe that I'm not lovable. And so I'm feeling really sad about that. So instead of, saying, well, sadness, we should just ignore that. That is the sadness that can lead us to that belief or that lie that's fueling, just distance that we're creating in our relationships. And so I think that's where the church community, if they can start to understand the role of emotions, the difference between thoughts and behaviors, it can really equip people to start to make, more distinctions on things that aren't serving us or things that we're doing that aren't really aligned with God's wisdom. But what I found in scripture is, God is described as having emotions. Jesus has emotions, and that Paul is really just exhorting people, what are you going to do with this anger? Are you going to sin? Or, be careful, because anger isn't necessarily the problem, but it's what you do with it.
Yeah. I'm struck with it, and it's true in our practice as well. The presenting problems that people come to our practice with often end up being just the foyer of the house in which we are invited into to explore. And I would love to hear you talk, Tristen, a little bit about how have you noticed your work in drawing people's attention to their emotion and to a kind of proper way of being in relationship with them. How do you discover that changes and nourishes and strengthens people's, we might call, sanctification process? How does it change their relationship with God in ways that have brought them to flourishing?
What I've experienced with emotion is that emotions connect us in our relationships. And so, just thinking in human relationships, that when my good friend or my client shares with me their sadness, I'm really drawn in. And it really can create like a bond. And I think that when you've lived your life ignoring or suppressing emotions, it makes it difficult for people to feel close to you, and that I think that affects your relationship with God as well. That I've noticed with clients when they can really be honest, first in the relationships with people about, ways that they've been really hurt and broken, or what they're really jealous about, or what they're really angry about, that breaks open their soul in a way that they can commune with God in a different way. And that, when we can tell God what we're really angry about and what we're really, feeling despair about, that helps our relationship with God, and it changes us. It's changed me in that way too.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that we talk about in the work that we do is if people ask what I do as a psychiatrist, and I say, besides the medical interventions and so forth, I think that one of the things that we think that we're trying to do is to enable people to tell their stories more truly. And by truly, we don't just mean telling them more closely aligned with the facts. What we're really meaning is telling them more faithfully, telling them more inclusively, including all the things that are true about their story. And I think about the way the two of you have beautifully articulated this notion of how we can get separated into thinking that our emotion is this thing that we have to put up with and that we have to sequester and, somehow contain just so it doesn't bother me too much. And what begins to happen, the richness that begins to flow into a person's life when we begin to take, dare we might say, a more biblical posture toward the way we've been made more fully with the breath of God. And I'm wondering, Jon, as you are discovering these things and you've had some sense of new way of being, I'm wondering how in the work that you do, how this has contributed to the work that you do with the Bible Project or anything else that you're doing that where has it had practical implication for you?
Well, I would say even just personally, it's had a lot of impact for me. I think I tell this story in the book where I was having a lot of anxiety, and because I would ignore my anxiety, not even pay attention to it, not even really understanding that I was having it. I think my body had to ramp it up, and it got to the point where I'd have these weird experiences where just like my thoughts were racing, everything seemed kind of loud, but then quiet at the same time, and still, but kind of frantic. It's just this weird moment. And for me, I experienced it in this detached manner of like, huh, what's going on? And at one point, Tristen, I was telling her about this, and she's like, that's anxiety. Yeah, that sounds like a panic
Let's
attack.
just be frank. That's not just anxiety. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I started to pay more attention to when this was happening and try to understand, well, what is it trying to communicate to me? And it happened actually at one point where I was dealing with a business partner that was having a hard time knowing if I could trust. And in my mind, I was giving myself all these reasons why I couldn't conclude whether or not yet decisively whether or not I can trust this guy. But my body had a different opinion, and it was trying to talk to me. And so actually just kind of one night waking me up, realizing this is why I'm having this anxiety, and then making a decision like, okay, I'm going to close off this relationship. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't understand, one, to be able to identify what I was feeling, but two, to be able to investigate what it is that this feeling is trying to communicate to me. And that same anxiety appeared when I was selling a business. This fear of, man, will I have enough? Will the sale of this business represent enough for the kind of freedom I want to be able to do the work that I want? I started getting really, really anxious about it and realizing that anxiety and actually being able to then bring that to God and like talk to God about it and having a really wonderful experience where God was able to pretty much tell me like he will be enough and me coming to terms with that. And that all happened through my understanding of that emotion. And so I do hope that it's also impacting kind of the organization that we're building. I mean, we have 100 employees now at Bible Project, and there's a proverb that when you have many ox, the stable are full, and it's talking about ox poop. That when you have a lot of ox to work the field, there's also a lot of ox poop.
Okay, wait. We're just people are gonna like press pause, rewind, play it again. Pause, rewind, play it again. Oh my gosh. Go ahead.
Yeah. And yeah, we all understand this. Like interpersonal relationships are hard. And it's hard because we don't always say what we mean. We don't always mean what we say. We don't always understand what we want. We don't always listen and try to understand what other people need. And it becomes really messy. And it's easy to try to abstract this to just this, like, well, just do the right thing, say the right thing, have the right processes. But underneath all of that is what I guess some people call an emotional intelligence, which is the ability for us to connect with each other at the level of emotions, our own emotions and other people's. And so that is important for a couple. It's important for organizations, and we're just starting to figure that out. And we'll have to continue to figure that out. But it's the way we respect the image of God in each other.
Tristen, in your bio, you describe yourself as the mother of two active boys, and so
Hmm.
I'm really, I mean, I know I'm the parent of a 28 and 31-year-old, and even still, there are times when my wife and I believe that we should be in charge of our children's lives. We would much rather be. We want to tell them, and the number of times that we feel things that we want to regulate. We would like our kids to do what we think they should do in order for us to regulate. And so, yeah, even I, as a clinician, have it's not always easy for me to step out of the father role and behave as if my emotion is like in charge of me rather than the other way around,
Yeah.
even with my
Hmm.
adult children.
I definitely understand that.
Yeah, I would love to hear you say more about how really working with this, not just learning about this, but really embodying this, not just embodying emotion, but embodying your awareness of all these things. How would you say that makes its way into your parenting, and what's that like for you? And how has even the work on this book contributed to what it's like for you to be a parent?
Well, one of the things that I've noticed is that being an empathic person, has its high side, but it also has its shadow side, which means that I feel what other people feel. And the shadow side comes out with my kids and my husband if they're really feeling intensely stressed and they're targeting, their anger, it's just coming out. Like it hits me in a way that it doesn't hit Jon. Like I can get caught up, I can get dysregulated pretty easily if they're dysregulated as well. And so I've just had to really be aware of, sometimes I just need to step away to regulate myself so I can even just be present with them and to just understand my limits. I think the Enneagram has been really helpful for me to give language of, really understanding that as an Enneagram 2, it's easy for me to want to ignore my limits and not really express what I need. And that really the growth point for me is to say, I've hit my limit. I need help. I'm sorry I can't be here for you right now. And that's very difficult as a parent, and then especially a two, um, to just acknowledge my limits. But I think the gift that I give to my family and my boys is for them to acknowledge their limits as well. And it's just really rewarding to hear from my boys using language that I didn't have as a kid. Like saying, I'm really afraid of being embarrassed or being an embarrassment. And that it just means so much to me that, they would be able to share that with me and feel safe to just say that their fear and concerns and, yeah, I can't fix it. But I can just hold it and know that they trust me enough that to just express that and know that, it's not going to be overwhelming for them if that happens.
Well, I think too about the way as you're talking, I'm thinking like, my goodness, like you are, when we think about the English language translation of Genesis 2:7, this notion, and then the Lord God formed the man out of the dust of the earth. This notion of forming, being intentional, being lengthy, it doesn't happen in an instant. He's not just stamping out widgets. And I think about the way, and he forms a physicality. There's this physicality that comes, at least initially, at least it would appear. And I think about how, even as we talk about emotion, I'm imagining as you are forming your boys, you're not just forming in them some abstract way of thinking about faith. By talking about emotion, by inviting them to put language to emotion, I'm picturing, given everything that you've told me, like I'm having this moment of kind of revelation, this notion of how you are forming their very bodies by drawing their attention to their emotion that they experience in their physicality. Myself as well, not something that my parents would have been drawing my attention to. And I think to myself, my goodness, how fortunate are your sons that they are being formed and being given opportunity to be introduced to the God who has made them as they truly have been made, because they're being introduced to all those parts as opposed to only some of them. If I get reincarnated, can I come back and be in your family? I would like to.
That's very sweet.
Like to do that.
Well, I think our boys would definitely say otherwise. But
I'm sure we're screwing them up in other ways.
yeah. If anything, what I'm hoping that they understand is that we are human, and that Jesus is really what we need in our lives.
Right. We were talking earlier on about the Bible Project. I think about the way, even the very physicality of what I've witnessed so far in many of the vignettes where there have been videos played out, the very physicality of how things are drawn and the way that it evokes things in the right hemisphere that allows me to imagine things that I can even feel literally in my body as I'm watching it being drawn in the video while I'm listening to the audio describing. And I also just want to say that in many respects, what you two have done in your book and what you then do, Tristen, in the clinic, and what, Jon, you and your folks are doing at the Bible Project are really enabling those of us who get the privilege of being in your presence to witness this full-bodied encounter with the Jesus who's coming for us. And it has been an utter delight to talk with you and to hear of your wisdom. And if people want to get in touch with you, we want them to have the opportunity to do that if you would so desire. If you would so not desire, you can just say, no, people may not contact me whatsoever in any way, shape, or form. But if so, how would people get in touch with you or find out more about your work, and tell us where they can access your book?
So the book, you can find it at whyemotionsmatter.com or just Google Why Emotions Matter. Tristen's website is tristencollins.com. Her spelling is unique, so maybe look that up, and you can find out more about her work there. And I'm most active online on my Twitter account, which is just at JonPDX, JONPDX. So if you want to say hi to me, that's a good way to do that.
And I'm not very good at social media, so you can find me on my website.
Yeah. Well, that's because you're spending time with real human beings, with your real human bodies in real time and space.
That's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, indeed. Very good. Well, to both of you, thank you ever so much. It's been a delight, and I am grateful that everyone has had the opportunity to meet you in this way. And I expect your work to continue to both deepen and expand the capacity for people's lives to flourish. So thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's very kind.
You have been listening to the NeuroFaith Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Curt Thompson, and today my guests have been Jon and Tristen Collins. I look forward to your joining us for our next episode this season as we continue our journey to explore life at the intersection of neuroscience in the light of following Jesus. Until then,